The Liberating Arts seeks to articulate the enduring relevance of a liberal arts education during a time of pandemic and protest. Through our online platform, we will host a series of conversations with writers, academics, institutional leaders, and public intellectuals about the nature of the liberal arts, their formational purpose, and their moral significance in a time of great cultural disruption. We hope to inspire viewers and listeners to learn more about the liberating effects of these arts on their own lives. To find out more, please visit www.theliberatingarts.org or find us on Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, or YouTube.
Welcome to another episode of The Liberating Arts. I am Rachel Griffis, and I'm excited about having a conversation today with Beth Newman, who is a theologian. And the topic of our conversation is going to be on leisure and academic culture. So Beth, I'm really excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am wondering if we can start by you providing an introduction to yourself and telling us a little bit about your work and interests.
Okay, sure. Well, I am currently a professor of theology adjunct at Duke Divinity School. Before that, I taught for 17 years at the Baptist Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. And my work is, I guess, centered on two sort of key themes. One of them is the unity of the church, and the other is really looking at sort of dominant issues in our culture that are raising questions about what it means to be the church or also to be the university or college. So my latest book, since we're talking about leisure, is called Divine Abundance. I'll hold it up here. Leisure, the Basis of Academic Culture. And really there I was trying to build on conversations that had been going on for a while, really, about how to rethink and reimagine some of the ways we are doing college and university so that we can have a broader, deeper vision of what that is about.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add that I read Divine Abundance pretty soon after it came out. I heard it mentioned at a conference and then went out and got it. And I definitely recommend it. It's really, really wonderful book that I think addresses some really difficult problems in the academy today. And I also heard Beth speak about the book and some of those ideas at Baylor's Institute for Faith and Learning conference. So I'm really excited to be able to talk more about it.
Okay.
I was wondering if, so we've started a lot of these conversations with a definition of the liberal arts. So I'm wondering if you have a definition of the liberal arts that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, Rachel, I think, well, when I was thinking about this, the word liberal is related to liber or libre, which is freedom. So I think that's so fascinating to think about that, because what are we doing when we teach liberal arts so that we are freeing people? And I think on the one hand, we're trying to free people from restricted or diminished ways of thinking, no matter what discipline we're in, and opening up their imaginations in new ways that they haven't been exposed to. I mean, I know that was certainly true when I was in college and what I also tried to do when I taught college. So there's that sense of freedom from, but I think the other aspect of freedom is absolutely central as well. And that is what is more positive freedom or freedom for. So what are the liberal arts for? You know, we're freeing people from these restricted or diminished views, but we're freeing them for something larger than ourselves. And one way that has been talked about this sort of classically are the goodness, beauty, and truth. And so that there is something that we are aiming to participate in, to embed our lives in, so that we are living, you know, truly free and faithful lives. And I think both of those components are really necessary, because without the sort of positive freedom, it can easily just become, you know, people going and doing their own things. There's no sort of unitive understanding. And That, granted, is not is a process together, because it's dynamic, and truth is dynamic. It's something we participate in together. So it's not like we're just sort of plopping it down, but we together need all the disciplines in order to discern that more fully.
Okay, yeah, really like how you're talking about the positive and negative freedom, which I think comes up a few times in your book.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we'll get to my first question about the book.
Okay. Okay.
So in Divine Abundance, you describe an ontological problem with the Academy. Can you explain this problem and provide some examples regarding where you see it?
Okay. Very good. And that's a great question, Rachel, by the way. So, ontology is a very broad term, and it refers to how we understand being. So, what I am trying to do in the book is try to say that one of the dominant understandings of being that has shaped the contemporary academy is one that is essentially mechanistic in many ways. So it's being, that being is facts. It's sort of a flattened understanding of being. It's like, here's the apple. Apple, it's red. It has a green leaf.
Yeah.
And then whatever I think about the apple, I mean, I might really like an apple. That's my subjective preference that I sort of impose onto it. And by the way, C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, has similar ways of thinking about this as well. So some people have traced that understanding of being back to nominalism, where you have basically just things that are isolated in themselves, like facts, and then values are things we impose onto them. By contrast, what I am describing in the book, and which I think is so important today, is that one way to say this is that communion is intrinsic to being. In other words, you can't have being without having communion already there. It's built in to the very nature of who we are. Augustine famously sort of captures this by saying, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O God. In other words, there's something about us it's not just our biological sense, but it's the whole of who we are is geared towards communion with other people and with God. And so in the fall, for example, I mean, one way to read that theologically is that we fall apart from God and from one another, and therefore lose the fullness of being. So, and so I refer to that when I say divine abundance. I'm talking about that abundance as living into the fullness of who we are. And it's not only for us, but for really all creation. That all creation, or the whole cosmos, participates in, if you could say, a divine wisdom, a divine beauty greater than itself. And so when we study different things, it's important to understand, the biological, the chemical piece, but how all of this fits together is also crucial as well, because to the extent we have this myopic understanding of being, then we also have a myopic understanding of who we are.
Okay.
So,
and so that is part of what you're seeing is the problem with the academy.
Right. And I think, Rachel, another way to come at it would be sort of the separation between facts and values. Because again, that's an ontology that sort of, the facts are there and the values are imposed part of things, or an imposed part of the nature of things. And that, of course, has been criticized many times over, that dualism that comes out of the Enlightenment. And so, in postmodernity, it's like, well, we no longer have that kind of, we no longer have these objective facts. But what we do still have in postmodernity is this sense that values are essentially our choices. And so, who I am is sort of the culmination of my choices.
Okay.
And what I'm arguing is that not all of who we are is explicitly our own choice. That there that there are things given to us that we are called to receive. And essentially, we are to receive ourselves as gifts from God. So the receptivity piece is really crucial here, for trying to think differently, than sort of this sort of value choice understanding.
Yeah. Okay, great. So can you talk a little bit about where you see this value as a choice in the academy?
Okay.
in perhaps what students are seeking, what professors feel pressured to give them.
Yes, yeah, very good. Well, I'll give you a concrete example from and it's one of the institutions I taught at when I was teaching in a college, and we were thinking together about, as faculty, about ourselves and what we're about, like faculty will do, argue and debate, which is all very good. But in one of the documents that was circulated, it was written, "We support diversity for diversity's sake." And the problem there is that, if there's nothing to give any sort of meaning or fuller purpose to diversity, then it can quickly break down into everybody doing their own thing, even within a department. Well, this is what I choose to do, this is what you choose. Diversity it can be a very good thing when it's used in a way to bring together and to reconcile. So we're working towards unity. But if diversity is simply each doing their own thing, then there's a real problem there. And I will say, I was looking back at just this is something I'd written elsewhere, not in the book, but a lot of people are familiar with the story of the blind man and the elephant. And if you're not, it's where all these 6 or 7 blind men come before an elephant, and each one has a different part of the elephant, like the trunk, the legs, the tail, and there's a poem written about it. And so, each man's claiming each part of the elephant, and the moral of the story is that no one is supposed to say, I have the elephant, because you only have the tail part, you only have this part. And so, so there's a kind of, implication that we should have humility about the particular truths that we have. But and that's certainly a Christian virtue. Yeah, we definitely want humility. But the whole story, I would say, that's forming that understanding of diversity really comes out of a kind of Kantian understanding of reality, where the noumenal is completely inaccessible in a sense, and all we have is our own human efforts.
Okay, yeah.
So.
Yeah, I was reviewing your book this morning as I was preparing for this conversation, and I highlighted a sentence that I think might kind of speak to what you're saying. For all the lip service then paid to diverse values and the encouraging of critical thinking, the modern academy easily serves one purpose: to prepare the student to compete.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's right. Yeah. There's always an underlying story there that is shaping how we think about things. Yeah. And that's that feeds in so much to really a kind of utilitarian understanding of education, that the idea that in capitalism we are our choices, whatever they are. And so then education too becomes sort of absorbed into that. And and so is there an alternative formation other than just competing in the marketplace that we have to offer? And and we hope there is.
Okay, yeah, I hope so too. So you've touched on this a little bit. So the story that's being told about the academy, and I think when you talked about your definition of the liberal arts, the idea of freedom from diminished thinking, or freedom to reimagine certain things about life or about study. So could you talk about some distorted stories that you see about the academy?
Yeah, okay, very good. I think, well, one that comes to my mind right now, just in light of what we've been talking about, is the story that wants to pit faith versus knowledge. And that is a story that, again, I mean, we can sort of track it historically, but that's really, in many ways, been the story of the modern academy, because you have like the faith or the church over here, and then the university or the college over here, as if they're doing different things, and they are doing distinct things, but often then that sort of reiterates this idea that you have faith in this sphere and knowledge in this sphere. And so a lot of the effort has been in terms of looking at Christian colleges, particularly the demise of them. Well, how can we get faith, back into the academy? And so, the focus has been on, getting the right trustees in some institutions, if they're not already too far gone, or campus ministry or clubs or different organizations, or sort of these sort of, extracurricular activities. And I mean, those are great. I think campus ministers are doing excellent work, so I'm not denigrating that, but that still is accepting the model often, that faith is here and then knowledge is here. And so, I would say, God calls us to love with our hearts and our minds. And so within the intellectual life of the school, I would say, just to go back, there is always some faith that is being already assumed, and to try to name what that is. So it's not a question of trying to get faith in, but trying to discern more deeply, well, what is the actual faith shaping the way we think about the intellectual life? So,
yeah, that reminds me of something that you say in the book also about thinking less, you're encouraging readers to think less about getting God back into the academy, but more about becoming persons who are seeking, let's see, I think seeking and listening to God in all places. I have a note about it.
Yes, right.
And then also what you say in the beginning, the love of learning and the desire for God are one and the same.
Right.
So I was also really interested in what you have said about sloth as part of this conversation. So you say that the academy's focus on productivity and hard work is actually a problem with sloth. Can you summarize maybe that argument for people listening to this?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, because the typical image we have of sloth is, well, the creature that is the sloth, this sort of lazy, sloth is laziness. And just to let people know, I mean, this argument that I am making comes from Joseph Pieper, who's the one who's put it out there most fully, and he wrote a book on leisure. But Pieper argues that sloth, laziness is a symptom of sloth. It's not itself sloth. But he argues, to go to your question, Rachel, that busyness and this hyper productivity and this need to sort of prove your worth by doing, that is also a symptom of sloth. So then we have to say, well, what is sloth? And the definition that Pieper puts out there, and it's continuous also with what I think Thomas Aquinas says, and Augustine also has a variation of this as well, that sloth is the failure to be who you are before God. So, okay, now how in the world do we be who we are before God? I mean, that's a big thing, but and obviously, Christians understand that we can only do that through God's grace, but it's certainly something that the desire to do that is already God's grace at work within us. So yeah, so I think that understanding is that, you know, whether it's, you know, and it could be the other way. It could be someone who says, well, I don't have anything to offer. Why should I even try? And just give up. I mean, that could also be a sign of sloth. So it's seeking to discern and to be more fully who you are before God. And yeah, so that requires not just doing, but it requires receiving as well.
Okay. Can you talk at all about how you've helped students in your classrooms to incorporate leisure into their work in order to combat this? I think I remember you talking about this at the IFL. Things that you've done with seminary students.
Yeah, Rachel, and yeah, and it was very much an ongoing a challenge for me, I must admit.
Yeah.
Because I'm one of these people that comes in, you know, with this whole agenda in my mind of what I want to do, which is, you know, isn't always the best thing in any case. But yeah, I think, well, the past few years I taught, I developed and I actually was influenced by some good friends with it, developed a liturgy for learning. And one of the things I was just trying to show there was that liturgy, which is, by the way, not a word that flows smoothly off Baptist lips, but you know, liturgy or worship. But we are always, and James K. Smith talks about this as well, we are always involved in liturgies in our life. And so you can think of the classroom as a kind of liturgy. And so I wanted to put that out there. So what does a liturgy of learning look like? And we did just some very simple things of opening the classroom with responsive reading. With sometimes I would incorporate readings that we would be looking at in class, like from Athanasius, and try to have them in a more meditative form. And, you know, then we would have, you know, sort of, you know, so the liturgy of, you know, of study then would be our classroom. And then it would be the liturgy sort of I can't remember how I phrased it, of or sort of departing. And it would just be a blessing that I would give to everybody. So it was fairly simple, but yeah, I think the real challenge at the seminary, the real challenge there was how to think more deeply about the integration between what we did in our chapel also and the classroom. So there was, you know, anything where it's blurring those boundaries, I thought was great, you know, whether, you know, so yeah, so those were some of the things I did.
Yeah, I like how you're talking about blurring boundaries, which I feel like that is a good expression for what liberal arts education is, you know, should be as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So, can you talk about how that where you see the struggle with sloth among faculty and maybe administrators? We know that students struggle with it as well, but I mean, I think that we, you know, I don't know, as much as we may try to, you know, orient students towards, you know, things more than a job, we are also, you know, really busy because we are trying to keep our jobs, get jobs, that kind of thing.
I know it exactly. Right. And I think, yeah, and in some ways the whole pressure, especially for untenured faculty, I mean, the whole pressure there, you know, to publish and to perform in the classroom, it doesn't really, you know, you don't get to put on your, you know, your tenure profile, oh, I had this time for leisure, you know. So and yeah, I think well, I mean, one thing I did really, I was able to do through a grant that I got from the Wabash Center at our seminary is we had some conversations about this, and it was sort of combining, looking at ways to integrate our disciplines. And so even you think a seminary would be more on board, but more harmonious in some ways, but we were still pretty separated. I'm doing theology, here's Hebrew Bible, here's New Testament. So we were all up. So we were, you know, we were thinking together about integration and also about leisure. And at least I was thinking about it and trying to sort of bring it in. So we got a grant to have a faculty retreat. And that was really quite wonderful. And what we did is we invited alums from the school to our faculty retreat. So we had about 20 alums come, and we met out in the woods, this retreat center. This was, by the way, as the institution was closing. So,
Okay. Yeah.
But in any case, it was a wonderful retreat. I mean, it's one of the best things. My best memories really of the seminary in many ways. But what it did was it just gave us space. I mean, we had time to walk. We sort of interspersed it with some prayer, with some good food, and with really deep conversation about, how were you formed at the seminary? What do you think the church needs for us to be doing better? So, I think trying to be, again, going back to blurring boundaries, or trying to be creative, to think about ways that we can make space for leisure. But in my book, as you know, I argue that leisure does require sort of time set aside, but leisure is also a way of being as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the question of self-reflection. How are we allowing ourselves to be formed? How are we forming students so that we are capable of being people of leisure? And by that, I mean people open to receptivity, to listening, to discerning the presence of God with us as we are.
Yeah. I really love how you phrase that. So I feel like that kind of gets into my next question about the scarcity mindset and a mindset of abundance.
Yes.
So could you talk about how you define that, the difference between those two mindsets?
Yes. And well, I think, abundance, I think we have to begin with the conviction that God provides what we need to be faithful. Okay, in spite of everything. I mean, we've all, and we've all been through a whole lot. I mean, we can all name a lot of things we've all been through in this past, year and a half, or how long it's been, approaching a year and a half. But nonetheless, I think it doesn't discount the difficulties we face. But I think we do have to start with this conviction that God will provide. And so that's where abundance comes from, is trusting that provision, being open and discerning that. We don't have to do that alone. We're not intended to do that alone. But we are intended to do that in community. And I think for an institution like a college or university that is situated, especially within the Christian tradition, is to always ask themselves, where is God leading us? Because that's where God's abundance is. And the scarcity is when we think, I think in the academy particularly, we think we have to make everything happen and we have to make things come out right. So I will tell you a story, Rachel. When I was at St. Mary's College, and we had some conflict there about the mission statement of the school. This was in South Bend, Indiana. Anyway, and there was some division there as well. But one of the sisters at the school came by my office, and I had already been hired to go to a different place at that point. But I was feeling very discouraged because it was just like, all these things. And I was a part of this this Christian conversation thing that had been oh shit, I'm blanking on it right now. Anyway, it's not coming up. But so we'd had these, but it was I didn't feel personally that things were going in the sort of rich way that I had hoped they'd go in terms of the disciplines and the intellectual life of school. But the sister came by and gave me this beautiful picture of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And she goes to me, Beth, God does not abandon us. And I just always loved that because here I was, the theologian, teaching religious studies. And the sister just comes and says very simply, God does not abandon us. And she, of everybody, I mean, had cause to be concerned. But anyway, that's just saying how the witness of others, I think, in reminding us and keeping the memory is not a past memory, it's a live memory that we have, and it's a future memory. How do we remember our future? That we need one another to help us with that.
Yeah, that's really great. I think that we probably need more of those kinds of statements in our classrooms, with our students to combat, I think, those diminished thinking, I think is the word that you used earlier on. But when I look at, and I'm sure that my institution is not the only one that does this, but if I look at the sort of like career trajectory that they chart out for students, like in your junior year, start meeting with career services, and then, do the resume workshop, and, like all of these things, that it really seems that a lot of that narrative that they're being told about what they need to be doing next and what they need to be thinking about seems to fall into that, what you were saying, the scarcity mindset of, we are the culmination of our choices and we make things happen. And
And I think, Rachel, that's very, very nicely stated. And it is, I mean, my son's in college right now and he's getting all of that, the same. But I think, to me, the language, and I know this has been very much a part of the ongoing conversation of Christian identity and higher education, the language of virtue here is also so helpful. So I contrast like values, like these are things we choose, versus virtue. How are we being formed, and what kinds of persons are we helping to form? So if an institution, not that students are going to be concerned, right, in many ways, certainly understandably, about what after school, but if institutions can also keep that question before them, how are we forming our students? What kind of persons do we want? Then that might sort of help alleviate some of that constant pressure.
Yep. I wonder how many times they hear the word job and employment and interview, versus like how many times do they hear, character, or, what, who do you want to be? Like, what kind of parent or spouse or neighbor, do you want to be?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Right. Exactly. What's funny, because I heard David L. Schindler, who is a Catholic theologian, once say that he told his children when they went to college, he said, I want you to, when you go to major, I want you to major in something that you can't do anything with.
That's amazing.
So it's an opposite, the opposite way. For most parents, temptation to think otherwise.
Yeah. What you were saying about the mindset of abundance, it reminded me of prayer. I think it was by Stanley Hauerwas with the Prayers Plainly Spoken. Am I remembering that correctly, that that's his book?
I think so, yes.
Okay, yeah. I think there's a prayer in that book that says something like, we have all the time in the world, or you have given us all the time in the world. And I used that with our faculty one year, at the beginning of our faith and learning stuff. And it's always kind of, I think a challenge to me to think about that, because it's so hard to think, to think like that we have all the time in the world. We have, God has provided what we need.
Right. Yes. Yeah. No, that's a great, actually, that's a great thing. I mean, that's a whole other issue is, how do we think about time? And is it just this sort of flat, homogeneous understanding of time, which would go along with what I was saying earlier about ontology? Or is our time always, in a sense, open to God's presence in the world? And in that sense, it can never be diminished.
Right.
So that's
so hard to think about how to change that thinking about time, though.
It is.
I don't know that I have a lot of answers about it, but I think it's
Right.
important at least for us to be talking about.
Yeah, no, Rachel, I think you're right. And honestly, I think that just goes, I think there does need to be certain understandings of rhythms and practices in place that help us, not because it's not more than just the head, right? We've got to be embodied in certain rhythms. And I mean, this is why I think, you know, the monastic understanding of time is so crucial, because it was written, it's in this daily rhythm of allowing God to place us in God's story rather than our story, and then we have room for God. So I think, you know, for the Academy to retrieve something like that, I think is really crucial. And I know there's some places that are doing forms of that, but that's certainly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer thought in his book Life Together. I mean, it was a kind of and he wasn't talking explicitly about the Academy, but he was writing more broadly about any community needing to have this rhythm that helped them remember who they were. So yeah, so that would be.
You mentioned a couple of places that you have seen that are moving in that direction of incorporating that monastic time. Do you have examples of programs or institutions that you've seen do that?
Ooh, okay. Well, I think there are some initiatives coming out of some churches that are trying to do some of that. I think, I mean, there's one that's just getting off the ground that I'm that I'm involved with a little bit. It's called a Center for Faith and Life out of First Baptist Church in Asheville, North Carolina. And it's really just going, but again, they are just trying to do something as a church that's geared towards education, that's open to the whole community. And their hope, I think, is to embed it in this rhythm. Now, right now with COVID, that's a little bit more difficult. Also, the Ecclesia Project, I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but that was the Ecclesia Project, EKKLESIA. There's an initiative also coming from them that's looking at education. And again, it's just in development. I don't know a whole lot about it, but it's going to be located in Black Mountain, North Carolina. But again, it's trying to, do a sort of reconception of education in some ways that is more embedded in a liturgical rhythm. Yeah. So those are two that come to my mind anyway.
Yeah, I would love to see more colleges and universities incorporating monastic time in what they're doing.
I would too. I would absolutely. And I think along with that, this is one, again, I think it's a challenge, but along with that is having some people actually, living in proximity to one another as a way to sort of also embody community on behalf of the whole. I mean, I think that was the other piece, certainly with Bonhoeffer, but and I think there are ways that you don't have to be Catholic. I mean, I think there are ways that Protestants can do that. So.
Right. Yep. And college life, I mean, there's still lots and lots of students who go and live in dorms together and eat together and, go to athletic practices together. And there's still a lot, I think, set up, that could,
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. Yeah. Why not? I mean, that's
So we've mentioned COVID a couple of times already, but I want to draw attention to the grant that's funding these conversations, which is called Between Pandemic and Protest. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the COVID-19 pandemic and then some of the protests that we have had recently regarding racism and justice. Have these things changed your perspective on education and the liberal arts in American society? Are there things that you think educators need to be thinking about because of these recent things that are going on?
Yeah, Rachel, that's a great question. Let me speak to the protests first, and then I'll speak to COVID.
Okay.
Yeah, I think definitely the protests. I mean, there are things that I guess our society, myself, others, already knew, but I think the protests have highlighted certainly deep and profound blind spots that we have had in our society. And even for me now to hear students who are African American in my class speak out more fully about what their own experience has been like, growing up as a Black male. I mean, for me personally, it's sort of like I sort of knew that, but just to hear that testimony, I think has expanded my understanding of how we need to think about issues of racism. And so I think, diagnosing is always an ongoing problem, and that we need to certainly be in the listening frame of mind for that. The prognosis, I think, as the church, our politics differs from the politics of the nation state. And so, unfortunately, the church has been very divided. And I mean, I'll speak in my own denomination with Baptist. I mean, you have the more conservative Baptists who are going to be Republican. You have the more liberal Baptists who are going to be Democrat. And, heaven help us if somebody from one went to the other one, and so that sort of, so all that to say, it's not to say there might, not be some good things coming out on the sides, but we have, for the Baptists, we have allowed the nation state to deeply shape our idea of politics. So I think our challenge in light of this is to say, look more deeply. And I learned a lot of this from Stanley Hauerwas. I also hope I'm saying it correctly. But, what is the politics of the body of Christ? It's not that we have church and politics, but the church already is a politic. And so how can we live into that? And yes, it might call for protest. I'm just reviewing this book right now called Reading While Black by a New Testament scholar. And, and so he's talking about protest as being embedded in scripture, in Jesus and in Paul, and then, going back into the Old Testament. So yes, that might be part of it. And, and then how then to think about reconciliation as well. So, I think, and that's certainly an ongoing challenge, but I think, thinking about it together, our politics as the body of Christ and as seeing each other's brothers and sisters in Christ, how can we move towards solutions that go even beyond the law? I mean, because the law can solve certain things, but the law can't entirely heal somebody. Or the law can't offer forgiveness. Or ask your confession. So, and I think with the other one was with COVID. So, I think on the one hand, it's been great. I think with COVID to be able to have meetings and to meet with people from around the world. And I'm involved in through the Baptist World Alliance with Baptist Doctrine and Christian Unity. And so we've been able to meet and have these great conversations. So I think all of that's wonderful. But I still think that education is incarnational, and that the primary venue of our education needs to be person to person. And I just to think like, some good things can happen on Zoom. I don't want to deny that. And we've all had to do that. So it's like, we're making the best of what we have. But we certainly, if in fact we're integrating leisure, which is contemplation, and which is receptivity, and which is worship, with learning, then that is going to be greatly sort of truncated through Zoom. So I guess that's one of the things that comes to my mind in terms of the COVID. So
I like how you phrase that as educational being incarnational.
Yeah.
I like that. And one of the things that my college has been meeting in person, since last August. And one of the things that I noticed when the students got back in August is that they seemed so grateful just to be there in the classroom, even though half of their face is covered up, like they're happy to be there. And I think that there's just something about being together in person that's lost over Zoom or
I think so. And I felt that way when we went back to church for the first time, and the church where we go is a very small church, but it was like, it's just so good to see other people and to be in their presence. So I think it is really grounded in the spiritual and the material are deeply intertwined with one another. And so Zoom still allows a kind of presence, but it's not the full presence of us to one another. So,
good. Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I just want to see if you have anything else that you wanted to say about your work that you think is relevant to the topics that we've covered.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I guess I think in terms of just one comment about my own interest in passion and unity in the church, and then also looking at education and some of the divisions that get going, between faith and knowledge. I think those two are interrelated. And one of the reasons I say that is because when I first went up to teach at St. Mary's, people were, very welcoming and everything, but there was a little hesitancy. I mean, I was Protestant, teaching in the Catholic, department, and that was pretty rare. I mean, there was one other one there, but I think there was a little hesitancy to engage me because it's like, oh, well, we don't want to offend her. I mean, I'm just speculating on this, but there wasn't a full, a full orbed discussion, and not only in the department, but across the college. There wasn't a full orbed discussion about Catholic identity, and I really wanted that because I thought, well, this will help me know more fully what it means to be Baptist. And, Pope John Paul II talked about the ecumenism as the exchange of gifts. So I think, for people to embed themselves more richly in their particular Christian tradition actually promotes the unity of the church. Now, there could be a way to do that, obviously, where you close yourself off, but to really go deep into your own tradition is to go deep into the story of the whole church, right? I mean, you're going really, you're gathering up those roots. So it's, in a way, you're discovering connections that you might not have known you had. So I think those two are deeply related.
Okay, that's really wonderful. I was just reading this book that IVP recently published, The State of the Evangelical Mind, where James K. Smith writes the closing chapter where he said, I think the title of it is something like The Future is Catholic. But he actually makes a similar claim where he says that figuring out what it means to be Protestant is how we actually are able to be Catholic.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So digging into the Protestant tradition, the evangelical tradition, that's what the book is about, was something that he recommended.
Right. So, yes. Yes. Yeah. Good. I'm not familiar with that, but yeah, I think that's really true. And, because the Reformation and the Protestant, it was protesting in order. It was certainly Luther's original intent in order to build up the whole church. So, we're not just, and so unfortunately we have denomination, like, mathematically, we're here, but really the idea of protesting or reforming, it's for the sake of the whole. So, so I think that's really the deepest way we need to think of who we are, because we are called to be one. In the oneness enables us to offer our distinct gifts more fully to one another. So, I mean, that's true diversity. That's
yeah, and that's really wonderful, I think, for thinking about the liberal arts, right, and the blurring of boundaries. And
yeah, right, yeah. Good.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much for this conversation.
You're welcome, Rachel. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And yeah, I love this kind of conversation. So I'm glad that you're promoting it.
Yes, thank you so much.